The screen was dark, quiet, almost breathless, when a small, trembling voice broke the silence. "Can you be my friend for just one day?" The words hung in the air like something fragile and frightened. Then, a hard cut into light. A large, greasy hand, Red Turner's hand, froze mid-twist on a wrench. Metal clinked once, then stopped. The sound of casual laughter, the scrape of boots on concrete, and the rumbling of half-tuned engines all fell silent at the same time, as if someone had shut down the entire morning. A dozen Hell's Angels turned their heads in unison, leather creaked, tattoos flexed, the sound of casual laughter. Leather creaked. At the center of them, his beard, gray at the edges and rough like steel wool, shifted as his jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, sharp and steady under the shadow of his brows. "What did you say, kid?" he asked, voice low, almost a warning. He was not used to anyone interrupting the morning ritual, let alone a voice that innocent. Near the old chain-link fence stood a boy, skinny, pale, 10 at most. His left arm was wrapped inside a cast covered in colored doodles, shaky signatures, and cracked stickers. His right hand clutched a wrinkled sheet of paper, folded and refolded, until the edges curled like tired petals. His sneakers were muddy. His backpack looked torn, hanging by a single strap. His eyes were too old for his face, holding a kind of worn-out hope that should never belong to a child. He took a tiny breath, the kind a person takes when they know they are stepping into danger but have already made peace with it. "Tomorrow is Friendship Day at school," he said. His voice cracked halfway through, but he forced himself to keep going. "We are supposed to bring a friend. I do not have any." No one laughed. No one even blinked. Tank, a mountain of a man with a shaved head and a chest like a brick wall, muttered under his breath, "Did he just say he does not have a friend?" Stitch, the youngest of the crew, swallowed hard. Poor kid sounds serious. Red felt something heavy settle in his chest. He had seen men beg for mercy, cry in bars, scream in alleys, but he had never seen a kid stand in front of the angels and ask for something this small and this enormous at the same time. The boy stepped forward, holding out the paper with a trembling hand. "I drew this," he whispered. Red took it carefully. The paper was warm from the boy's grip. On it was a row of motorcycles, drawn in bright crayon colors. Some leaned crookedly. Some had misshapen wheels. All of them had the skull and wing emblem of the Hells Angels drawn above them, messy but unmistakable. At the bottom of the drawing, written in uneven letters, were the words, "My friends." Red looked down at the paper for a long second, then back at the boy. "You drew this?" he asked. The kid nodded shyly. "People at school say the Hells Angels are bad, but you look nice." A strange quiet spread across the lot, for men used to being treated like trouble, like danger, like monsters in leather jackets. Those words hit harder than a punch. Like danger. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eli." "Well, Eli," Red said, "you have guts walking up to us like this." Eli shifted his weight, his cast bumping lightly against the fence. "My grandma says I do not think before I do thing." A few of the men chuckled. The sound was small, unsure, but enough to melt the frost on the moment. Red noticed something then. The boy was scared. Yes. Eli looked down at the cast and the faded marker stars drawn on it. Brave in the way only a kid who has been lonely too long can be. "What happened to your arm?" Red asked gently. Eli looked down at the cast and the faded marker stars drawn on it. "I fell off a bike trying to show the boys at school I could ride. They laughed. They called me Metal Boy. They said, 'Nobody wants a broken friend.'" Red's jaw tightened again. Tank swore under his breath. "Bear." The oldest of them shook his head and muttered, "Kids can be crueler than grown men sometimes." Red rose to his full height. The boy had to tilt his head back just to keep looking at him. "Where is your mom?" "Kid," Red asked. Ellie hesitated. "She works a lot. 2 jobs. She tries her best." "And your dad?" The question made Eli's face change, just slightly, like a shadow crossing over. "He left." No one spoke after that. Red exhaled slowly, a breath, heavy enough to seem like it carried years. He reached into the inside pocket of his leather jacket and pulled out a small cloth patch, the miniature Hell's Angels emblem, black and white threads worn soft by time. He placed it gently into Eli's good hand. "Consider this alone," Red said. "You are one of us for today." Eli stared at the patch in wonder, like it was a piece of the sky someone had scooped down and handed to him. A smile flickered on his face, fragile but real. "So," he said softly, "you will come." Red glanced at his men. Tank was shaking his head. Stitch was wide-eyed. Bear was leaning forward with interest. The rest hovered between disbelief and something softer. Red looked back at Eli. The kid stood there holding that patch like it meant everything. "I will think about it," Red said. Eli nodded, as if that answer was already more than he expected. "Thank you for listening," he whispered. He turned and walked away. His torn backpack bounced against his small back halfway down the block. He paused and looked over his shoulder. Red lifted a hand. Eli lifted his in return, then disappeared around the corner. Silence settled over the lot again, but it was not the same silence as before. Stitch let out a long breath. "Damn kid is braver than most guys I know." Tank grumbled. "We are not actually going to show up at some school event." "Right. People will lose their minds. We are not actually going to show up at some school event." He just kept staring at the empty road, the crayon drawing still in his hand. Something in that picture broke him open a little. Maybe because he remembered being that kid once, too small for his own jacket. Something in that picture broke him open a little, too hungry for someone to stand with him. Bear walked up beside him. "You thinking what I am thinking?" he asked. Red looked at the drawing again, the crooked bikes, the shaky letters, the sun drawn in the corner like a promise. "I am thinking," Red murmured, "that nobody should have to walk into school alone." Tank groaned. "Red, come on." Red raised a hand, stopping him. He did not need to say anything else. Something had shifted, something quiet but strong. A cracked open place that could not be closed again. Behind them, the sun rose a little higher. The engines cooled. The diner doors swung open for the breakfast crowd. But the men did not go back to fixing their bikes. They just stood there, staring at the street where Eli had vanished. Each of them turning over the same thought in their heads. A kid had asked them for one day, and deep down, each of them turning over the same thought in their heads. Every one of them already knew the answer. They just had not said it out loud yet, casting long shadows across the schoolyard. The faint hum of distant voices mixed with the sounds of kids rushing to school, eager for the start of another day. Red Turner sat quietly atop his Harley, his eyes scanning the school's facade with a mixture of reluctance and resolve. The other bikers were scattered around the parking lot, leaning against their bikes, half focused on the commotion outside. Eli had been standing at the edge of the yard for what felt like hours, staring at the ground, his hands gripping the crumpled drawing Red had given him earlier. His backpack hung loosely from one shoulder, and his cast, decorated with messy scribbles, was nearly as much a part of him as the worn shoes on his feet. His heart raced as he looked at the sea of children moving in and out of the school entrance. He wasn't used to this feeling, this mix of hope and dread that gnawed at his gut. He turned towards the row of motorcycles parked just beyond the school gates, the low rumble of engines, the metallic shine of chrome. He turned towards the row of motorcycles parked just beyond the school gates. They really came. The words played over and over in his mind, a mantra that pushed him forward, even as the doubts crept in. The laughter of the other children rang in his ears. But today, it was different. This time, it wasn't just him against the world. It was a group of men. These men had promised to be here. Red's gaze followed the boy standing by the fence. Eli was waiting for something, but it wasn't clear whether he was waiting for a savior or a disaster. Red knew the look. He'd worn it himself once. A long time ago, there was a time when he'd felt exactly like that kid, caught between hope and fear, waiting for someone to either crush his spirit or offer a hand. Red dismounted from his bike and stood up straight, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. His hands were still covered in the grease from working on the bikes, but today, it wasn't about the machines. It was about something else, something real. As he walked toward Eli, the sound of engines revving up around him, the air seemed to freeze. Eli's head snapped up, and for the first time that day, their eyes met. There was something fragile in Eli's gaze, something too wise for a child so young. The boy's chest rose and fell quickly as he took a hesitant step forward. Did you really come?" Eli's voice was barely a whisper, almost lost beneath the noise of the bikes. His eyes darted from one biker to the next, unsure if he was truly seeing what he thought he was. Red nodded slowly. "I told you we would." Eli's face lit up like a Christmas tree. His grin, so wide and genuine, almost felt like a weight had been lifted from the air. His grin, so wide and genuine, felt light for a second. The tension that had been building all morning seemed to melt away. The world was still harsh, still full of unanswered questions. But for Eli, it didn't matter. In that moment, the weight was shared. For just a heartbeat, everything seemed perfect. The harshness of the world outside faded into the background. The bikes, the leather jackets, the intimidating presence of the Hells Angels, they weren't a threat today. They were Eli's friend. And for the first time, Eli wasn't invisible. He wasn't alone. But as the moment stretched, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, like the distant rumble of thunder before a storm. Then came the voice. "Stop right there." It cut through the air like a blade. Then came the voice. Eli froze. The happy moment shattered instantly. His grin vanished as the force of the voice hit him like a slap to the face. He didn't know who it was at first, just a harsh, commanding presence that had no place in the bubble of safety he'd felt for those few seconds. Red's smile faltered. His body tensed, and for the briefest moment, a flash of something, anger, frustration, maybe fear, crossed his face. He turned slowly, his gaze narrowing. The principal of the school, Mrs. Greer. His body tensed, determined steps. Her face was red, her lips pressed into a tight line. Beside her was the police officer, his hand resting on the holstered weapon at his side. The picture was clear, the calm was over, and whatever came next would be anything but peaceful. "What are you doing here, Mrs.?" And whatever came next would be anything but peaceful. Her finger pointed directly at Red. "This is a school zone." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence, and it was enough to make the hair on the back of Red's neck stand up. It wasn't just anger in her voice. It was fear, the kind of fear that made people act before they thought. Eli's heart skipped a beat. The smile that had only moments ago stretched across his face was gone, replaced by a look of pure shock. The world around him seemed to spin. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to feel this way, and he certainly hadn't expected it to end like this. Red's hand twitched at his side. His gaze met Mrs. Greer's, and for a split second, he felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He wasn't used to being the one who had to answer to authority. It wasn't that he feared confrontation. It was more about what came next. The officer beside Mrs. Greer took a step forward, his hand still on his gun, but not quite pulling it. His presence was heavy, his hand still on his gun. Red didn't move. He didn't say anything at first. His eyes were fixed on Mrs. Greer, his jaw tightening as he processed what had just happened. The kids, the bikes, the promise they'd made, it all felt like it could slip away in an instant. The bikes. As the tension grew, Red's lips parted just slightly. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let some school administrator or cop stop what he knew was right. Eli stood frozen next to him, unable to speak, unsure of what would happen next. The laughter of his classmates, faded into the background. It was just him, Red, and a handful of men who had shown up for him. But now the adults had entered the scene, and everything seemed uncertain again. The scene froze for a moment, just a moment, but it felt like hours. Time was stretched thin. Red looked back at Eli, his eyes searching for any sign of doubt, but the boy's face, though pale, was still determined for just a heartbeat. They shared something, a bond forged in silence, in the shared understanding that sometimes standing up for someone meant standing up against everything else. And then, in a flash of movement, Mrs. Greer and the officer closed the gap, their presence swallowing the space between them. The screen faded to black. The tension was thick in the air, the silence almost suffocating, as Mrs. Greer continued to stand in front of Red, her eyes filled with fury. Behind her, the officer's hand was still resting on his gun holster, ready to intervene if things escalated. Red didn't move an inch. His gaze was steady, his posture solid, as he waited for her next move. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't here to fight. He was here for something more important, something much bigger than the petty power plays of a frustrated school administrator. "I told you already," Red said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "We're not going anywhere. We're here for Eli, and that's that." Mrs. Greer shot him a look of pure disdain. "This is a school," she snapped, her voice rising. Greer shot him a look of pure disdain. "Not. Whatever this is, I'm not here to disrupt." Red replied calmly, "I'm here to help that kid. He's got nothing else. And today, we're all he's got." She opened her mouth to say something, but the officer stepped forward, trying to assert control. "You don't get to decide that. This is a school zone, and you're trespassing." Red didn't flinch. "You can keep your rules. We're not leaving until we do what we came here for." "What's the problem with that?" The officer hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the large group of bikers waiting nearby. Red had seen that look before, the look that said someone was running out of options. Mrs. Greer turned her eyes toward the officer, silently pleading for backup. But the officer hesitated again, looking back at Red. Something about the quiet resolve in Red's posture made him hesitate. Finally, Mrs. Greer clenched her fists and stepped aside. Something about the quiet resolve in Red's posture made him hesitate. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "You can stay, but not inside. Wait outside. Do you hear me?" Red didn't respond right away. He simply nodded once and turned, heading toward the bikes with his brothers following him, the rumble of their engines filling the air. Eli stood at the edge of the yard, watching the scene unfold, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't sure what to do, his heart racing in his chest. This wasn't how he'd imagined it, but somehow it felt like this was exactly what he needed. Red stopped before reaching the bikes and turned back to face him. His gaze met Eli's, and for a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. Without saying a word, Red gave a subtle nod. He wasn't here to hold Eli's hand, but he wasn't alone anymore. Eli's fear wasn't gone, but the presence of the Hell's Angels, standing tall in their leather jackets, felt like a shield. But the presence of the Hell's Angels. Red didn't wait for Eli to approach. He turned and walked toward the bikes, letting the kid make his own decision. This was Eli's fight now. Eli hesitated for a long time. He looked down at his cast, at his trembling hands. He could still hear the laughter of the bullies in his head, the taunts, the whispers. He wanted to fight back, but now, standing here, it felt like the hardest thing in the world. Then, he remembered Red's words. "This is your fight, Eli. We're right behind you." He wasn't alone. Taking a deep breath, Eli pushed open the door of the school. The hallway stretched before him, cold and quiet. Like a tunnel he was being forced to walk down. He felt small, but there was something else there, too. Something new, something he hadn't felt before. Inside the hallway, Eli was acutely aware of the silence. It was the same silence he'd felt when the bullies had cornered him in the hallways before, except now he wasn't alone. He had a purpose, he had a plan. He stepped forward cautiously, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. But as he rounded the corner, he saw them, Dylan and the other boys who had tormented him for so long. Dylan stopped, his eyes widening for just a fraction of a second before his signature sneer returned. Well, Dylan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look who finally decided to show up." Eli's throat tightened, but he didn't break eye contact. "Look who finally decided to show up." This was the moment. Dylan took a slow step toward him, his eyes scanning Eli up and down. "You think they'll protect you?" Dylan taunted. "What's next? You gonna go cry to them like a baby?" Eli swallowed hard, his hands still trembling. "You gonna go cry to them like a baby?" Anything. His hands still trembling. He wanted to say something, waiting for the inevitable. Dylan took another step closer, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "You think you're special now," he sneered. For the first time in his life, Eli didn't feel the rush of panic. His heart was still racing, but there was something else underneath it. He wasn't the scared little boy he used to be. Not anymore. But that didn't mean he was brave. Not yet. Just outside, Red stood near the bikes, watching through the windows, his eyes narrowing as he saw Eli step into the hallway. The tension in the air was thick, but Red didn't move. He wasn't going to intervene. Not yet. This was Eli's fight now. Red's eyes followed the group of bullies as they circled around Eli. He could see the tension in Eli's shoulders, could see the slight quiver of fear in his hands, but the kid wasn't backing down. Red stayed where he was, his gaze intense. There was no turning back for Eli now. There was no turning back for Eli now. Inside the hallway, Dylan was inches away from Eli now, his voice low and menacing. "You're not special," he said, "and you never will be." Eli didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he stood his ground, feeling the weight of every word, every stare, but he didn't back down. And then, just as Dylan moved even closer, something caught his eye. Something outside the window. His eyes flicked toward the window, and for just a second, Eli saw the shift in Dylan's face. His expression faltered. Dylan's eyes went wide for just a moment, but he quickly masked it with another sneer. Eli didn't look away. He didn't flinch. Dylan sneered again and glanced back at Eli, but this time, his smile faltered. Eli didn't look away. Not now. And outside, Red stood, watching, waiting. The tension was unbearable. Dylan did not move out of the way. The hallway felt narrower with him standing there, shoulders loose, eyes sharp. His friends fanned out to either side, a crooked line of worn sneakers and nervous smirks. Behind them, the lockers hummed with the faint rattle of textbooks and shifting backpacks. Overhead, the fluorescent lights buzzed in a thin, irritated whine. Eli's cast felt heavier than usual. Sweat prickled along his spine beneath his shirt. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, hot and uneven, but his feet stayed planted. Bells about to ring. Dylan said, voice low and lazy. Halls for people who actually have friends to walk with. Metal boy. One of the other boys snickered. The sound scratched at Eli's nerves like sandpaper. His fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. Through the small pane of glass in the classroom door beside them, Eli caught a slice of outside. Leather. Chrome. A hint of red's dark outline. They were still there. That was all he needed to know. He swallowed. His mouth was dry. When he spoke, his voice surprised him. Then maybe you should get to class, Eli said. It was not loud. It was not brave in the way movies showed bravery. But it was straight. It did not wobble or break. The snicker died. For a second, Dylan just stared at him, lips parted like he had not heard correctly. Then the grin came back. Sharper. Say that again, Dylan said, stepping closer. Eli's back pressed against the cold metal of a locker. The air smelled like floor cleaner and old paper. He kept his eyes on Dylan's face, not on Dylan's hand, not on the brief twitch in his jaw. I heard the bell, Eli said. You should get to class. Dylan leaned in so close, Eli could see the tiny burst of broken capillaries around the bridge of his nose. His breath smelled like cheap cereal and mint gum. You think those guys outside make you tough, Dylan murmured. You think they will be here forever. Eli's heart punched against his ribs. For an instant, his gaze flicked sideways, to the window again. The bikes were just shapes behind glass now, distant, but real. No, Eli said. He did not add the rest, that he did not need them to make him tough, not right this second, that he just needed them to have shown up once. Dylan's hand shot out and tapped the edge of Eli's cast with 2 fingers. A quick, sharp rap that sent a jolt up his arm. Not hard enough to break anything, hard enough to remind him what it had felt like to hit the dirt. Careful, Dylan whispered. Would not want you to fall again. A classroom door at the far end of the hall opened with a squeak. A teacher's voice floated out, calling names. Dylan's friends shifted, suddenly less sure. One of them glanced at the door, at the teacher in the cardigan who had stepped halfway into the hallway, scanning for stragglers. Dylan straightened, rolling his shoulders back. He kept his eyes on Eli for a beat longer, then leaned in just enough for Eli to hear. Bell rings after school, he said. They will be gone by then. We will not. Then he stepped away, bumping Eli's shoulder as he passed. The others followed, like a small storm cloud drifting down the hallway, leaving the air heavier behind it. Eli stayed where he was until the last sneaker squeaked around the corner. Only then did he notice his knees were shaking. He let out a breath. He did not realize he had been holding. His fingers ached from how tightly he had been gripping the strap of his bag. Slowly, he peeled himself off the locker and forced his legs forward. One step, then another. As he reached his classroom door, he glanced back towards the front of the school. Through the far window at the end of the hall, he could still see a blur of movement. A leather jacket, a chrome fender catching the pale light. He lifted his chin, opened the door, and walked in. He lifted his chin. The classroom smelled like pencil shavings and hand sanitizer. Heads turned. A few kids stared openly. Others looked away quickly, pretending they had not been watching. Ms. Carter paused in the middle of writing the date on the board. The chalk hovered. Her eyes settled on Eli, taking in the cast, the tight line of his shoulders, the way his chest rose and fell a little too fast. "Good morning, Eli," she said gently. He nodded. "Morning." He walked to his desk without looking left or right. His chair scraped softly as he sat. The worksheet that said Friendship Day across the top lay where he had left it, the blank lines waiting. Out of habit, his eyes darted toward the window by the far wall. From this angle he could see only a small patch of parking lot, the edge of a tire, a slice of sunlight on metal. It was enough. Ms. Carter cleared her throat and set the chalk down. "All right, everyone," she said. "Let us settle in. We have a special day today. We will start with morning work, and then we will talk about our friendship projects. Let us settle in. Kids twisted in their seats, whispering names, important people, cousins, neighbors. Some desks already had extra chairs pulled up beside them. Eli's desk had only the worksheet. He picked up his pencil. The tip was dull, chewed at one end. His hand hovered over the first question. Name of your friend. The hallway scene replayed in his head in quick, sharp flashes. Dylan's face, the tap on his cast, the promise about after school. His stomach clenched. He wrote slowly. Red. Outside. The bikes waited. Red leaned against his Harley with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the squat brick building. The morning air was cool, not yet warmed by the sun. The smell of exhaust mixed with fresh-cut grass from the soccer field nearby. Bear stood beside him, chewing on a toothpick, gaze following the line of classroom windows. Tank paced a short strip of sidewalk, boots scuffing concrete. He went in. Stitch said quietly, "You saw him, kid." Did not bolt. Red grunted. He had seen the small hunched shoulders straightening at the last second. The hand on the door, principal is still watching. Tank muttered, jerking his chin toward the office window. A shape passed behind the glass, then disappeared. She can watch, Bear said. We are not doing anything. They were not smoking. They were not revving engines. Helmets rested on handlebars. The club patches on their backs gleamed clean. For once, they looked less like a gang and more like a wall. Red kept his eyes on the main entrance. Just remember, he said, we are here for him, not for them, he said. Tank replied, tell that to the looks we are getting, not for them. A couple of parents stood near their cars, hands wrapped tightly around coffee cups. One woman pretended to fiddle with her phone while sneaking glances at the line of bikes. A man whispered something to her, never taking his eyes off the angels. One woman pretended to fiddle with her phone while sneaking glances at the line of bikes. You think the kid will be okay in there? He asked quietly. Red did not answer right away. He thought of Eli's face in the lot, the way his voice had not cracked when he answered Dylan. He thought of the small quiver in his hand. He has to be, Red said. That is the whole point. Inside, the day moved in small pieces. Math worksheets, reading time, the scrape of chairs as kids moved into groups. Each time Eli walked across the room, he could feel eyes on him, some curious, some cautious, one or two openly annoyed. He caught snippets of whispers, some cautious, the biker kid. My mom said they are dangerous. He kept his gaze low and his step steady. At recess, the air outside tasted like dry dirt and cut grass. He kept his gaze low and his step steady. The squeal of metal chains on swing, the thud of sneakers on packed earth. Eli stood near the edge of the blacktop, his cast tucked close to his chest. He could see the bikes from here more clearly, lined up like some kind of silent guard. Dylan and his crew occupied their usual spot by the basketball court. A group of kids clustered around them, leaning in when Dylan spoke, laughing at the right moments. Every once in a while, one of them would glance over at Eli and then away, like they had seen something they did not want to admit. Ms. Carter watched from the steps, her hand shading her eyes. One of them would glance over at Eli and then away, invisible but real. A ball bounced near Eli's feet. He looked up. A smaller boy, hair sticking up in uneven clumps, jogged over. Can you toss it? The boy asked. Eli bent to pick it up, his good hand closing over the rough surface of the rubber. He lobbed it back in a careful arc. The boy caught it with a grin. Thanks, he said, before sprinting back to his game. It was nothing. A ball. A word, but it was more acknowledgement than he had gotten in a long time. He let his eyes drift toward the fence. Red was still there, leaning, waiting, like the day had nowhere else to be. By the time lunch rolled around, the noise in the cafeteria felt thick. Trays clattered, milk cartons snapped open. The smell of pizza and bleach battled in the air. Eli carried his tray carefully, trying not to jostle it against his cast. He scanned the tables. Most were already full. Chairs pulled close in tight circles. Kids sat in clusters, backs turned in toward one another. He spotted an empty space at the end of a table near the window and made for it, keeping his head down. Halfway there, Oleg shot out. His foot caught, his tray pitched forward. Milk sloshed. A slice of pizza slid in a slow, horrible arc toward the floor. He stumbled but did not fall. The tray hit the ground with a loud clatter, food splattering across the tile. The cafeteria went quieter than it should have. Laughter bubbled up from the table to his left. Dylan stood there, leaning back in his seat, one arm draped over the back of the chair. His friend smirked beside him. "Careful, metal boy," Dylan said, voice light and bright enough for the nearby tables to hear. "You know how you get when you fall." A few kids snorted. One or two shifted in their seats. Uncomfortable. Eli stared at the mess on the floor. His face burned. For a moment, his vision blurred. The old instinct rose up, the familiar urge to apologize for existing, to disappear, to let them have this close by. A lunch monitor started toward him, frowning. Her shoes squeaked sharply on the tile. Eli took a breath. Then another. He crouched, as best as he could with one arm, and began to pick up the pieces. He did not look at Dylan. He did not say a word. A shadow fell beside him. Another pair of hands reached down, helping gather the spilled food. He glanced up. Mr. Alvarez, the janitor, gave him a small nod. His hair was more gray than black now. His coveralls stained from a lifetime of cleaning up after other people. "Got it," Mr. Alvarez murmured. "No worries, kid." Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Something passed there. Recognition, not from today, not from this spill, but from another fall, another cleanup, a dirt bike, a broken arm, a boy in a hallway trying to pretend it did not hurt. Eli straightened, his tray now empty, his lunch reduced to scattered crumbs and a crushed carton. "Go sit," Mr. Alvarez said quietly. "I will take care of this." Eli hesitated. "Thank you," he said. Mr. Alvarez's gaze slid past him to the table where Dylan sat, still smirking. "Some messes," the janitor said softly, "clean themselves up, eventually." Eli blinked. He was not sure what that meant, not exactly, but it stayed with him as he carried his empty tray to the trash and then sat at the lonely corner table by the window. Outside, through the glass, the bike still gleamed. Red shifted his weight, as if he could feel the shape of what was happening inside, even without seeing it. Near the end of lunch, in the quiet that comes just before the bell, Mr. Alvarez pushed his cleaning cart into the small office near the back of the cafeteria. He closed the door behind him, the latch clicking softly. Against one wall, a monitor flickered. The school's security feed showed a split view of the front entrance, the main hallway, and a small section of the cafeteria floor. On one screen, earlier footage played back in grainy color. The hallway. On one screen, Dylan, the shove toward the dirt bike weeks ago. The fall. The kids scattering before any adult turned the corner. Mr. Alvarez watched the clip for a long moment, jaw tight. He glanced at the timestamp in the corner of the screen, burned into the image in pale digits. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small flash drive, and slid it into the side of the aging computer. Outside, pulled out a small flash drive, loud and final. The footage continued to play, quietly, as the drive's tiny light began to blink. By the time the lunchroom emptied, and the noise bled back into its usual dull hum, Mr. Alvarez had already made up his mind. He closed the door to the tiny security room with a soft click, and leaned his weight against it for a second, listening. No footsteps, no voices, Just the low hum of the old computer and the faint buzz of a fluorescent bulb that should have been replaced 3 years ago. On the monitor, the paused frame still held, a stretch of hallway, a cheap dirt bike leaned at a bad angle, a small boy in a cast that would come later. For now, his arm was still bare, his face still unmarked. Alvarez pushed himself upright and stepped closer. His knees ached the way they always did after too many hours on the mop, but there was an urgency in his chest that drowned it out. He hit play. The clip rolled. The hallway came to life in grainy color. Dylan and his friends slouched against the lockers. The cocky looseness of kids who had never had to be afraid of being believed. They shoved the bike forward, blocked the path, laughed. Eli appeared at the edge of the frame, hesitant, small. Words without sound passed between them. Heads tipped back in laughter. Hands gestured toward the bike. Eli swung a leg over. Even knowing what came next, Alvarez flinched when it happened. The wobble, the skid, the blur of motion as the bike tipped, the skid. Eli hit the floor and did not get up right away. Dylan's friends recoiled, then scattered as the image shook with the impact. No one reached for him. Alvarez hit pause. The timestamp in the corner glowed in pale numbers. He noted it without thinking, cataloging like he always did with broken windows and flooded toilets. There was a rhythm to keeping a building running. Log the time, log the damage. This was damage. 2. He slid the small flash drive fully into the port. The tiny light blinked hard, then settled into a steady pulse. As the file copied over, his reflection flickered faintly in the dark glass of the blank monitor beside it. A much younger face flashed in his mind for a heartbeat. Another hallway, another fall. No cameras then, no proof. Just a nurse's note and a shrug from the adults who said boys will be boys. He had not had this kind of tool back then. He pulled the drive free and closed his hand around it. The principal's office smelled like coffee that had gone cold twice and been reheated once. Papers sat in neat stacks on the desk, the edges perfectly aligned. Diplomas in dark frames lined the wall behind her, issuing a quiet reminder of authority. Principal Greer looked up when he knocked, irritation flickering across her features before she smoothed it away. "Yes," she asked. "Make it quick, please. I am in the middle of emails." Alvarez stepped inside, the door easing shut behind him. He held the flash drive between his thumb and forefinger like something fragile. "I need you to see something," he said. She glanced at the drive, then at the clock on the wall. "Can it wait until after dismissal? We are already dealing with enough today." "It should not," he said. The firmness in his tone pulled her gaze fully to his face. Alvarez rarely insisted on anything. He fixed what broke. He swept what fell. He kept his opinions tucked away like spare screws in a pocket. Greer studied him for a heartbeat, then pushed her chair back a fraction. "All right," she said. "What is it?" He crossed the room, set the drive down beside her keyboard, and gestured toward the computer. "Hall camera, near the back doors. Day of the accident. Hall camera." For a moment, something tight crossed her features. She had filed that whole incident in the drawer labeled unfortunate but handled. Day of the accident. For a moment, something tight crossed her features. Parents upset, but not screaming. It had been easier to leave it there. "We already reviewed the footage," she said. It was inconclusive. Alvarez shook his head once. "Not this part." She hesitated, then slid the drive into a free port. The system whirred, old fans grinding to life as the machine recognized the new device. A folder popped onto the screen. One file. The name was simple. Eli Hall. She double-clicked. The screen filled with the hallway image. Greer leaned forward, elbows on the desk. Alvarez stepped back, giving her room. From the speakers came only the faint static hiss of system noise, but the picture was clear enough. She watched Dylan and his crew appear, watched the blocking of the path, the show-off swagger, the pointing toward the bike. Her jaw tensed as Eli edged into the frame, shoulders drawn up. Pause, Alvarez said quietly. She did. He pointed to the corner. Look at the timestamp. She read it. The numbers meant nothing at first, then clicked into place. That was not after lunch as she had thought. That was earlier, before the office call, before the nurse, before anyone had told her anything. He let the clip run. She watched the dare, the reluctance, the shove, masked as encouragement. The fall, the way Eli's body hit the floor, the flinch she could not stop, the scattering of the others. Backs already turned when the kid tried to push himself up on a suddenly useless arm. The mouse sat motionless in her hand. In the reflection on the dark bevel of the monitor, she could see her own face, pinched and pale. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "Since that morning," Alvarez said. "I filed a report, mentioned what I saw. I do not think anyone read it, so I pulled this, just in case." The just in case hung between them like a weight. She sat very still. Outside, a bell rang faintly down the hall, signaling the end of a period. Feet thundered overhead. The school moved on its tracks, kids being shuffled from one room to another, while in here, something refused to move. Greer swallowed. "We logged it as a solo accident," she said slowly. "No witnesses." "You had one," Alvarez replied, voice soft but unyielding. "And a camera?" The words were not accusing. That almost made them worse. She leaned back, one hand pressed to her mouth. A headache she had been ignoring all day pressed harder against her temples. She thought of the complaints she had half read, the nurse's note she had skimmed, the harried sense of too many tasks and not enough hands. It was so easy, in a school like this, to let one quiet boy fall through the crack. Now she was watching it happen in real time on a screen. "How much else is on here?" she asked. "A clip of the fall. Enough context," he said. "Timestamp. Camera number. If someone wants to say it did not happen, they will have to look at that and say it to themselves." Silence stretched. Then she reached for the mouse again and rewound the footage. She watched it twice more, slower this time. The second replay, her eyes were not on Eli. Slower this time. The second replay, they tracked Dylan's face. When she stopped the clip, "Thank you," she said quietly. "Leave it." Alvarez nodded once and stepped back. His chasm at hers briefly, something unspoken passing there. This was not his fight to finish. He had done what he could. He slipped out, the latch catching softly behind him. Greer stared at the frozen frame on the monitor for another long moment. Then she dragged the file into a folder on her desktop and renamed it "Not Accident, Not Ellie." She typed, "Bullying Incident. Hall Cam." Her reflection in the screen watched her do it. Eli did not like being called to the office. That was usually for kids who broke things loudly, not the ones who broke quietly. When the knock came on the classroom door, and the secretary's aide stuck her head in, his stomach dropped before his name was even spoken. "Eli," she said, "the principal would like to see you." Chairs creaked. A few whispers floated. Ms. Carter's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but she gave him an encouraging nod. "Take your time," she said. "You can finish the worksheet later." He rose, the legs of his chair scraping softly on the floor, and followed the aide into the hallway. The air out here felt different, cooler. Somehow, the sounds of the classroom muffled behind the closed door. They walked past the rows of lockers, past the window, where he could just make out the line of bikes outside. One of the men, he thought it might be Bear, shifted his weight and glanced toward the building as they passed. Eli did not lift his hand, but he felt a thin thread of steadiness tug through him. The aide dropped him at the office door with a quick, distracted smile and disappeared toward the copier room. He stood for a second, hand hovering near the handle, then pushed his way inside. Principal Greer was behind her desk, but the usual stack of papers had been pushed aside. The computer monitor was turned slightly, facing not just her but also the chairs in front of the desk. "Have a seat." "Eli," she said. He did, lowering himself slowly into the chair. The cushion was thinner than it looked. He could feel the hard board beneath. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The clock on the wall ticked too loud. Greer folded her hands on the desk. Her face looked different today. "Les distant," more worn. "I am going to show you something," she said. "Then I am going to ask you a question." "All right." His fingers knotted together in his lap. "Okay," he whispered. She turned the monitor fully so he could see it and clicked play. There he was, in the hallway, whole, walking toward Dylan and the others. The bike, the laughter, the way he had tried, just for a second, to look like he could belong among them. He watched his own body climb onto the bike with a strange sense of detachment, as if he were seeing someone else make the mistake. He watched the wobble, the slip. He watched himself hit the floor, small and sudden, like something dropped by accident. He watched them leave him there. His throat burned. Greer did not look away from the screen until the clip ended. Then she reached out and tapped the space bar, freezing the image of him on the ground. "Is this what happened?" she asked quietly. He nodded, jaw too tight for words. "Did anyone push you?" she asked. "Did they dare you? Laugh when you fell?" He swallowed hard. The memory pressed up against his ribs, sharp and exhausting. They said I was scared." He managed, said, "If I did not try, I did not belong. When I fell, they thought it was funny." His voice cracked on the last word. He hated that it did. Greer closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. There was something raw there, under the professional calm. "Did you tell a teacher?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Miss Carter, the nurse. I think Mr. Alvarez did, too." "Did you feel like anyone believed you?" she asked. He looked at the frozen image on the screen, at the timestamp she had made him read aloud once already. "No," he said. The word felt like a stone dropping. She sat back slowly. He said, she said. It was simple, not wrapped in explanations or excuses, but he heard the weight behind it. It was not just for him. It was for whatever part of her had decided an overworked nurse, and a stack of forms were enough. He did not know what to do with the apology, so he said nothing. Greer let the silence sit for a moment, then straightened. When she spoke again, the softness in her tone had hardened into something else. "Eli," she said, "what you told us should have been taken seriously the first time. It was not. That is on us. But now we have proof, and we are going to do something about it." His fingers, which had been curled into the fabric of his jeans, loosened slightly. What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," she said, reaching for the phone on her desk, "this is not just between you and those boys anymore. It is between them and the school." She dialed an extension with practice speed. The line clicked, then rang once. "Front office," she said. "This is Principal Greer." Her gaze flicked to Eli as she spoke, steady and unwavering. "I need you to locate Dylan Harper and the boys who are usually with him," she continued. "Have security escort them to my office." A beat of silence on the other end. Eli could hear the faint reply, but not the words. "Yes," Greer said. "Now." She set the handset back in its cradle with a soft, final click. Eli's stomach flipped. Somewhere out in the building, doors were opening, names were being called, feet were starting to move. For a second, his mind filled with the sound of a dirt bike going sideways. The echo of laughter, the tap of fingers on his cast. Greer folded her hands again, looking at him across the desk. "Stay right here," she said. "You do not have to say anything else." Just stay. He nodded, breathing shallow. The walls of the small office suddenly feeling too close. Out in the hallway, footsteps began to draw nearer. The footsteps stopped just outside the office door. Eli sat rigid in the chair, fingers locked together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The hum of the overhead light seemed louder now, a thin electric whine that needled at the back of his skull. Principal Greer's phone lay in its cradle, the monitor beside it still holding the frozen image of him on the hallway floor. A soft knock came, then the door opened. The security officer stepped in first, broad shoulders filling the doorway. Behind him shuffled three boys with that particular restless energy Eli knew too well. Dylan walked in at the front, chin tilted up, yuff set. The two boys who always trailed him came next, their eyes sliding around the room, never quite settling. They all stopped when they saw Eli. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The air felt heavier than before, as if someone had turned the gravity up just a notch. "Close the door, please," Principal Greer said. The officer did. The latch clicked with a small, final sound. "Have a seat, boys," she continued. There were only 2 chairs left in front of the desk. Dylan took one without hesitation, dropping into it like it belonged to him. One of his friends squeezed into the other. The third boy hovered slightly behind, half perched on the radiator under the window, as if ready to bolt. The security officer stayed by the door, arms folded, eyes steady. The security officer stayed by the door, then she folded her hands on the desk and looked at each boy in turn. Greer let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable. "Do you know why you are here?" Dylan shrugged in a way that was meant to look relaxed. "No idea," he said. "We just got called down." She watched him for a moment, measuring. "We are going to talk about the day Eli was hurt," she said. "The day he broke his arm." Dylan's eyes flicked once toward Eli, then away. "We already told the nurse about that," he said. "Hefel, end of story. One boy, a bike, a mistake." One of his friends added quickly, "That is what we said." Eli stared at the edge of the desk, breathing shallow. He could feel Dylan's dismissal like a hand pushing him back down every time he tried to sit up. Principal Greer did not raise her voice. "I know what you said," she replied. "What I am interested in now is what actually happened." Dylan's jaw tightened. "That is what actually happened," he said. "He wanted to try the bike. He wiped out. We just happened to be there." The friend on the radiator bobbed his head a little too fast. "Yeah, just an accident." Greer reached for the mouse. "Let us watch it together," she said. She clicked. The screen came to life. The hallway appeared, that familiar stretch of lockers and scuffed tile. Eli could see the top of his own head as he moved into frame, small shoulders hunched. He watched Dylan lean against the lockers, watched the bike in the middle of the hall, watched the invisible conversation unfold. He did not need sound to remember the word. "Here is where you said you just happened to be there," Greer murmured. On screen, Greer murmured, one hand on the bike, shoving it an inch closer. One of the others nudged Eli's shoulder. Eli saw himself hesitate, then swing his leg over the seat. He flinched again at the fall, even though he knew it was coming. The boys on screen jerked back, then turned away. Eli, lying there, curled slightly around his arm. The camera caught every movement, every non-movement. Greer let it play until the frame showed only an empty hall and a small, crumpled figure on the floor. Then she hit pause. No one spoke. The faint sound of traffic floated in from somewhere outside. A soft rush that made the silence inside feel sharper. "Looks a little different when we all watch it together, does it not?" she said. Dylan's eyes were fixed on the screen, but his face had gone cold and flat, the way someone's did when they were trying very hard not to show that anything had gotten through. "That does not prove anything," he said, but there was a hitch in the middle of the sentence. He still chose to get on the bike. No one forced him. One of the boys muttered. Greer leaned forward. I see you, she said quietly, telling him he does not belong if he does not try, pushing the bike toward him, standing there when he hits the ground and does not get back up, then walking away. She turned her head slightly toward Eli without taking her eyes off Dylan. Is that what happened? She asked. Eli swallowed. His tongue felt too big in his mouth. Yes, he said. The word dropped between them like a weight. Greer nodded once, as if she had expected that answer, and needed him to say it anyway. She looked back at Dylan. We have a bullying policy in this building, she said. You have heard me talk about it in assemblies. You have seen the posters in the halls. It does not just cover name-calling or pushing someone against a locker. It covers creating a situation where someone can get hurt because you wanted to make a point. Dylan's nostrils flared. It was a joke, he said. Dylan's nostrils flared. His friend on the radiator shifted, words spilling out before he could stop them. We thought he would just, fall and get up. We did not mean enough, Dylan snapped, shooting him a look that could have cut. Greer did not interrupt. She let the cracks widen on their own. When she spoke again, her tone had changed, less gentle, more official. I am going to be very clear, she said. This is no longer about who thought what was funny in the moment. A student was injured badly enough to require a cast. We failed to act when he reported that others were involved. That ends today. She reached to the side and lifted a thin folder from the desk. Eli recognized his own name, written across the tab in dark marker. In here, she continued, I have the nurse's report, Miss Carter's notes, and Mr. Alvarez's incident statement. Now we have this footage, and the timestamp that proves when it happened. This is the record. It does not go away because someone decides it was all a joke. The security officer shifted his weight near the door, the keys on his belt jingling softly. The sound made one of the boys flinch. What happens now? Dylan asked. There was still defiance in his voice, but the cool certainty had chipped away. What happens now, Greer said, is that this moves beyond this office. I will be notifying your parents. There will be a formal disciplinary hearing. Because the injury required medical treatment, there is a possibility the district may involve law enforcement. That will be their call. The room seemed to shrink around the boys at those words. This could go on your record, she added, for high school placement, for sports eligibility, for scholarship consideration. You may have thought it was just a bike and a laugh. The paper trail will not see it that way. One of Dylan's friends spoke up, voice small. Are we suspended? Effective immediately, she said. You are removed from recess and after-school activities until this is resolved. I will decide on in-school or out-of-school suspension after I speak with your parents. Dylan's jaw clenched. His eyes finally left the screen and flicked toward Eli, sharp and hot. The look carried something that had nothing to do with jokes. Eli forced himself not to look away. Why is he here? Dylan demanded, jerking his chin toward Eli. If this is about us, because he is the one who got hurt, Greer said evenly. And because this stopped being just about kids in a hallway the moment you chose to make him feel like he did not belong, he deserves to hear what is being done about it. Her words landed with a weight Eli was not used to having on his side. It made his chest ache in a different way. Greer set the folder down and folded her hands again. You will wait in the conference room next door until your parents arrive, she said. Officer Reed will escort you. The security officer straightened. The boys shifted, scraping chairs and shuffling feet. For a moment, Dylan did not move. Then he pushed his chair back slowly and stood. As he passed Eli's chair, he stopped, just long enough that it was clear he meant to. His voice dropped to a low murmur that did not carry past the desk. You think this fixes anything, he said. You think they are going to like you now. Eli's throat tightened. His first instinct was to look down. He did not. He kept his eyes fixed on a spot over Dylan's shoulder, where the plaque on the wall caught the light. The officer cleared his throat. "Let us move. Gentlemen," he said. Dylan gave a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh if there had been any humor in it. Then he turned and followed the officer out, his friends trailing behind, the door shut with a thud that seemed louder than it should have been. The office felt too quiet after they were gone. Greer exhaled slowly, the kind of breath someone lets out after holding it all morning. She turned the monitor back toward herself and minimized the video window, leaving only her own reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen. She did not look at Eli right away. Instead, she reached for her notepad and jotted a few quick lines, the kind of breath someone lets out after holding it all morning. When she finally raised her head, her expression was sober but steadier than before. "This is going to get bigger," she said. "Once I call their parents, once I notify the district, it may not stay just inside this building. People talk. Stories spread. This time, I would rather they spread with the truth attached." Eli swallowed. His palms were damp against his jeans. What do I do?" he asked. "For now," she said, "you do not have to do anything else. You told the truth. That is more than we asked of you the first time." She glanced toward the window behind him. Through the slats of the blinds, a slice of the front lot was visible. The sun glinted off a line of chrome like a row of small, controlled fires. "There is one more call I need to make," she said. He frowned. "To who?" She hesitated, then gave a small, wry tilt of her mouth. "To your mother first," she said. "She deserves to hear this from me, not from hallway whispers." Her hand hovered over the phone, then paused, and then, she added, eyes flicking once more to the glint of metal outside, "I think I should speak to the men who have been standing out front of my school every day. If this is turning into a conversation about safety and respect, it should include everyone who showed up when it mattered." Eli's heart stuttered. The idea of the principal and Red in the same room made his mind whirl. Greer lifted the receiver and began to dial, each button a small, decisive sound. Eli sat very still, listening to the ring on the other end of the line and the faint noise of voices moving in the hallway outside, feeling for the first time that whatever came next would not be quiet at all. Principal Greer stared at the phone for a long second after Eli stepped out. Her hand hovered above the keypad, stiff with hesitation. She wasn't a timid woman. She'd dealt with angry parents, board members, even police reports. But this, calling the men outside, felt different. She typed in the number Eli had nervously recited earlier. The digits stared back at her. She closed her eyes. She typed in the number Eli had nervously recited earlier. The digits stared back at her. The phone rang only once. Exhaled once. A low, "Yeah." Greer straightened instinctively. "This is Principal Greer of Ridgeway Elementary. Am I speaking with—" She hesitated, then forced the title out. "The Guardian of Eli Turner." A pause, a faint rumble of engines in the background. "The Guardian of Eli Turner." Greer's throat tightened. She clenched the receiver. "I need you to come to my office. Immediately. It's concerning Eli." Another pause. No breath, no movement. "It's concerning Eli." "We're coming." Just static. The call dropped, pulse hammering at her neck. Something in his tone made the room feel smaller, the air thicker. She stood quickly, smoothing her skirt, forcing herself to regain composure. The door opened. Her secretary, Ms. Holloway, poked her head in, face pale. Principal, you should see this." "What is it?" Ms. Holloway swallowed. "They're here." The office suddenly felt colder, The sound reached them before the bodies did. Heavy boots, slow and synchronized, like the start of a parade that wasn't for celebration. Students in the hall pressed themselves against lockers as shadows stretched across the tiles. Heavy boots, leather creaking, metal clinking. Greer stepped out of her office. The hallway had frozen. Near the far end, blocking half the corridor, stood Red, Bear, Tank, and at least 8 more men in their patched leather, broad shoulders, heavy boots, and expressions carved from stone. Teachers peeked from classroom doorways. Students darted into bathrooms. A few kids whispered in terrified excitement. Red stood in the middle, unmoving, like a statue someone had carved straight out of asphalt. His hands were relaxed at his sides, but his presence sucked all the oxygen from the space. Greer steadied herself and began walking toward them. Her heels clicked too loudly against the floor, betraying the tremor she tried to hide. Red's eyes found her the moment she moved. No hostility, no politeness, just a flat, unreadable weight that made her heart jitter. Behind her, Ms. Holloway whispered, "Should I call security?" Greer didn't look back. "They're already here," she murmured. She kept walking. 20 feet. 10. She kept walking. Then she stopped, close enough to smell the cold air trapped in Red's jacket, close enough to see the faint scar at his jawline. The hall was dead silent. Red tilted his chin slightly. "You called." Greer forced her voice steady. "Yes, I did." Bear's gaze swept the hall, dangerous, evaluating, predatory, until it landed on her. Tank's hands hung loose and ready, as if he expected someone to lunge. Greer held her ground. "I need to speak with you," she said. Red didn't blink. "We're listening." "I meant privately," she corrected. Red's expression didn't move, but the men behind him stiffened. "Whatever you gotta say." Tank muttered, "You can say it right here." A ripple went through the hallway. Teachers retreating behind doors. A stray student tripping over a backpack before someone yanked him out of sight. "I'm not discussing a child's safety in a hallway of spectators," Greer replied sharply. "If you want this handled professionally, you come into my office." Red shifted his weight, not forward or back, just enough to tell the world he'd heard her. Bear leaned slightly toward him. "Your call." "Boss." Red's eyes stayed locked on the principal. Then, slowly, he nodded once. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." Greer turned and began walking. She could hear them behind her. Heavy steps. Slow. Controlled. The hallway parted for them like a wound opening. As Greer approached her office door, Miss Holloway stood frozen beside it, hands pressed to her chest. Red paused at the threshold. His eyes flicked around the small office. Bookshelves, certificates. The corner with the worn chair Eli had been sitting in minutes earlier. Greer stepped aside to let him enter, but Red didn't move. Instead, he looked past her shoulder and whispered something low to Bear. Bear nodded once, stepped back, and muttered to the others, "Circle up. No one comes close." The remaining men positioned themselves around the office doorway, forming a quiet, formidable perimeter. Students on the far end of the hall gasped. Red finally entered the room. Greer shut the door behind them. The soft click was deafening. Inside the small office, the air was tight. The soft click was deafening. He remained standing, broad frame crowding the space, jaw ticking once. "What happened?" he asked. Not gently, not aggressively, just inevitable. Greer clasped her hands to stop them from shaking. "I'll explain everything. But first," she reached for the USB lying beside her computer. "You need to see this." Red's eyes narrowed. Greer took a breath, slid the USB into the port, and clicked open the file. The frozen first frame filled the screen. Red stepped closer, his shoulders lifted slightly. Greer hit play. The room went still. As the video rolled, Red didn't breathe, didn't shift, didn't blink. He watched every second with the stillness of someone holding fire inside their bones. Greer could feel the temperature in the room dropping with each frame, like a storm thickening just outside the door. When the clip ended, she paused it on the image of Eli on the floor. Red's jaw clenched so tightly the muscle trembled. He spoke without looking away. "Where is Dylan?" Greer swallowed. "In the conference room with his parents. We're about to begin a formal disciplinary." Red turned his head toward her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't threat. It was colder. It was the moment before action. Greer's throat dried. "We're handling it," she said quickly. "You must let the school process run." Red stepped closer. Close enough that she could hear the quiet breath through his nose. Close enough to know he wasn't convinced. Close enough to understand the exact danger of summoning a man like him. The office door rattled suddenly. A knock. Sharp. Urgent. "Mrs. Holloway's trembling voice seeped through the wood. "Principal Greer, the Harpers are here, and they're demanding to see you now." Red's eyes didn't leave hers. Greer slowly turned toward the door, her hand lifted to the knob. She hesitated. Red didn't. He spoke 3 quiet words that froze her in place. "Open it. Now." The knob turned, the door cracked, light spilled in. The moment the door swung open, the air in the office shifted. Sharp, tense, electric. Principal Greer's shoulders stiffened as 2 figures stepped inside. Mr. and Mrs. Blythe Harper, Dylan's parents. Mrs. Harper entered first, thin heels tapping the floor with the precise rhythm of someone who believed every room belonged to her. Mr. Harper followed, broad, suited, and carrying the smugness of a man who'd negotiated his way out of every consequence in his life. But both froze the second they saw Red. Red didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge them. He stood anchored in the center of the office, a silent monolith carved from steel and fury. Greer swallowed hard. "Thank you for coming," she began. "We have serious matters." Mrs. Harper cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Where is he?" Greer blinked. "Where is who?" "Our son." Mrs. Harper snapped. "Dylan said he was summoned." "Mrs. We demand an explanation." Red's head tilted slightly, slow, deliberate, like an animal registering movement in the underbrush. "Mr. Deliberate. And who is he supposed to be?" he asked, nodding at Red. "Security. A janitor." "Who let him in?" Greer's mouth opened, but the words tangled. Red spoke before she could gather them. "The man your kid hurt." A stunned silence fell across the room. Mrs. Harper drew in a tight breath. "Excuse me." Red's eyes didn't leave her. "You heard me?" Mr. Harper set his jaw, trying to reassert command of the space. "This is highly inappropriate." Harper set his jaw, trying to reassert command of the space. "This is highly inappropriate. We are here to discuss a disciplinary misunderstanding." Principal Greer instinctively reached out a hand. Whether to stop Red or steady herself, she couldn't tell. "Let's all remain calm. We are here to discuss an incident involving your son." Mr. Harper scoffed. "Incident? He told us he and another boy were roughhousing. Kids being kids." Red's stare hardened. "Your kid tried to break him." Mrs. Harper's chin lifted sharply. "Do you have any proof of these outrageous accusations?" Greer's breath caught. She knew this moment was coming. She crossed to her desk, clicked her mouse, and pulled up the paused video frame on screen, the one she'd watched just minutes earlier. Everything in Red went still. Mr. Harper stepped closer to get a better look. "What's that?" he demanded. Greer didn't respond. She hit play. The room filled with the sound of gravel, metal scraping, wheels skidding. The footage captured everything in brutal clarity. Dylan shoving the handlebars. Eli losing control. The violent fall, the limp body on the ground, then laughter, cruel, small, victorious. Mrs. Harper gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Mrs. Harper's face drained of color. The video ended. Greer paused the screen on the image of the boy lying motionless. No one breathed. Finally, Mr. No one breathed. Harper choked out. Edited. You can't just. Red cut him off. That's your son. Mr. Harper snapped his head toward him, offended. And who do you think you are speaking to me like that? Red stepped closer again, close enough that Mr. Harper, for the first time, took a step back. I'm the one who picked your victim up off the ground, Red said quietly. I'm the one who carried him to his mother. I'm the one who watched him try to hide how scared he was. Mrs. Harper bristled. You have no right. Red's voice dropped lower, colder. He's 8 years old. Red's voice dropped lower. Greer looked at the Harpers. This is now a legal matter. The school board is involved, and I am obligated to report this to child protective authorities. Mr. Harper's composure cracked. You're not talking to some low-income nobody, he snapped. We have lawyers. We have influence. You can't threaten us. Greer lifted her chin. I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you. Mrs. Harper shook her head in disbelief. Our son is not abusive. He's spirited. He's confident. Red's voice sliced through her words. He's a bully. The silence after that word felt like ice forming. Mrs. Harper trembled with indignation. How dare you? How dare you raise a kid? Red interrupted. Who laughs when another kid bleeds? Mr. Harper's nostrils flared. This is harassment. Red took another step. Bear and Tank loomed in the doorway behind him, silent, unmoving, but unmistakably present. Greer could feel the situation tilting, the tension sharpening like a blade edge. Mr. Harper tried to recover. Greer could feel the situation tilting. We will be filing a complaint with the district about your lack of control in this school. Allowing these men to walk around. Greer spoke with unexpected steel. We will be filing a complaint with the district about your lack of control in this school. Straightening his jacket, the Harpers stared at her. Greer continued. Because your son is responsible for a serious injury, and because I will not allow any more children to be harmed under my watch, Mrs. Harper sputtered. You're siding with them. With a gang. Red's jaw flexed. We're here for one kid. That's more than you can say. Mr. Harper rounded on Greer. I want to speak with Dylan right now. Greer nodded once and turned toward the door. He's waiting in the conference room. But before she could take a step, Red spoke. I'm coming with you. Greer froze. That's not appropriate. Red didn't break eye contact. He hurt someone I care about. I need to see his face when he explains why. Tank's voice rumbled behind him. We all do. Greer's heart pounded. She knew this wasn't protocol. She knew this was a disaster waiting to ignite. But she also knew, deep in her bones, that trying to stop these men now would be like trying to stop a storm with a paper umbrella. She exhaled, sharp and uneasy. Fine, she said, but you stay silent. Let me handle the questioning. Red nodded once. Mrs. Harper bristled. We will not allow these men near our child. Greer turned to her. You don't have a choice. The words stunned even her. She walked toward the door. Red followed. Bear, Tank, the Harpers, pale with fury and fear, moved after them. The small group stepped into the hallway. Students scattered like birds startled by thunder. Teachers retreated behind doors. The building held its breath. At the end of the hallway, a conference room door sat closed. Behind it, Dylan waited. Greer reached for the handle. Red stood beside her, shoulders squared, eyes dark. Red stood beside her. The Harpers hovered at the back, whispering frantic, broken things. Neither side bothered to hear. Greer wrapped her fingers around the cold metal handle. The hallway went silent. Red breathed in once. Greer pulled the door, just an inch. The door opened. Not all the way, just enough for Principal Greer to see inside. The lights were low. A rectangular table sat in the center of the conference room, glossy and too clean, reflecting the fluorescent buzz overhead. At the far end sat a boy with his fingers laced together, twisting nervously. Dylan. His eyes snapped up the second Greer's face appeared around the door. He tried to mask the flicker of fear with something he thought looked confident, but the edges gave him away. His heel tapped the tile under his chair in a nervous, stuttering rhythm. Greer stepped inside. Red followed. The air shifted again. Dylan straightened. Red followed. The air shifted again. Swallowing hard, he called out, "Mrs. Harper," squeezed through the doorway behind the others, the clatter of her heels sharp enough to fracture glass. "Mr." Harper came in tight on her shoulder, one hand already raised, like he was prepared to object to every act of gravity in the room. Bear and Tank didn't enter, but their shadows stretched through the doorway, wide enough to block anything behind them. Greer motioned toward the front of the room. "Sit," she said firmly. "All of you." "Mrs." Harper sniffed indignantly. "We're quite fine standing." "I wasn't asking," Greer answered. The tone cut through the tension, slicing clean. "Mrs." Harper stared, stunned, then sat down beside her son. Mr. Harper reluctantly followed. Red remained standing, arms crossed, silent, watchful. Greer paced toward the far end of the table and rested both palms on the polished surface. "Watchful." "Dylan, we reviewed footage of the incident. We know what happened." Dylan's throat bobbed. Mr. Harper cleared his throat, already leaning forward. "We object to the framing of this. Children fall off bikes all the time." Greer didn't raise her head. "Not like this." She slid a printed still frame across the table, Dylan staring directly at the camera, elbows locking, hands pushing, the wheels beginning to tip. Mrs. Harper gasped softly. Mr. Harper blinked, his jaw tightening as if he were preparing a counter-argument he no longer believed. But Red didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Dylan's voice broke through the silence, small and uneven. That wasn't my fault." Red finally spoke. Harper blinked. Dylan's gaze flickered toward him, pupils narrowing with instinctive teenage defiance. "You can't tell me what to do." Red stepped forward once. The boy went silent. Mrs. Harper shot up, half standing. "Sit down," Greer barked, sharper than the crack of a snapped twig. Mrs. Harper sank back, trembling. The room stilled again. Red's voice was low, controlled. "I'm not here to hurt you, kid. If I wanted to, every adult in this room knows I wouldn't need your permission." Dylan's eyes stayed locked on him. "If I wanted to," wide, with the kind of fear that came from understanding exactly how small you were. "I'm here for a reason, because the person you hurt matters, and because you don't get to pretend it didn't happen." Dylan curled his hands into fists on his lap. "It was a joke," he muttered. "We were just messing with him." "Messing," Red repeated. "You knocked a kid unconscious." Dylan flinched. Mrs. Harper leaned closer to her son, whispering fiercely, "Don't say another word." Harper leaned closer to her son. "Dylan." Greer spoke before Dylan could fold behind her. "This is your opportunity to explain why you did this." "Yours." Mr. Harper tried again. "We will not allow him to be interrogated by a criminal." Red turned his head slightly toward him. "One look." Mr. Harper fell silent. Dylan's gaze drifted to his lap, trying to steady himself. He was annoying," he finally said. "Always talking, always acting weird. Everyone got sick of him." The words hung in the air like smoke. Red inhaled once, Deep. Greer's voice was steady. Did you tell your friends to stay back? Dylan hesitated. They didn't want to get in trouble. You mean, Greer said, they didn't want to be on camera. Dylan stiffened. Greer leaned in closer. You weren't just bullying someone smaller, you orchestrated it. Mrs. Harper slammed her palm on the table. We're done here. Our lawyer will. Sit down. Greer snapped. The force in her voice rattled even Red. Mrs. Harper froze. Red slowly lowered himself into the chair opposite Dylan. His weight made the metal legs creak. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at the boy. Not with hatred, with something far heavier. You're not a monster, Red said quietly. Not yet, but you're walking straight toward becoming one. Dylan twitched, caught between fear and indignation. You think this makes you strong, Red continued. Pushing around somebody who never had a chance. Laughing when he bleeds. That's not strength, that's cowardice. Mrs. Harper tried to interject, but Greer raised a hand without even looking at her. Red kept going, voice smoother now but somehow colder. And the worst part, you did it because you knew he wouldn't fight back. That wasn't an accident. That was a choice. Silence rippled across the table. Dylan swallowed hard. I didn't think he'd really get hurt. That's the problem, Red said. You weren't thinking at all. Dylan looked away, blinking fast. For a moment, just a moment, the defiance cracked. The boy's eyes glossed. His breathing trembled, but before anything real could push through, he clenched his jaw again. Mister. Harper slammed both palms on the table. This interrogation is over. We're leaving. He grabbed Dylan's arm. Red stood. One motion, the Harpers froze. Not because Red touched them, but because he didn't need to. His voice was ice. You're not going anywhere. Greer exhaled sharply. No one leaves until I file my report. And until next. Steps are determined, Mrs. Harper sputtered. Next steps, Greer nodded. Suspension. Formal investigation. Possibly expulsion. And police involvement. The Harpers erupted at once, shouting, protesting, threatening legal recourse, waving imaginary authority. Like swords, but their noise didn't matter, because Dylan wasn't looking at them anymore. He was staring at the door, at Eli, but their noise didn't matter, waving imaginary authority. Like swords, the small figure stood frozen in the doorway, eyes locked on Dylan's, not even Red. The Harpers fell silent. Red's breath hitched. Greer straightened. Dylan's cheeks flushed red. Eli didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't step inside. He simply stood there, quiet, steady, unflinching. The boy he hurt, the boy he expected to break, the boy who didn't. Dylan's face contorted. Rage, shame, fear. Even he didn't know. He lunged to his feet. Don't look at me like that. Mrs. Harper grabbed him. Dylan. Red moved an inch. Bear and Tank shifted in the doorway. The whole room tilted. Tension coiled tight as wire. And then the fire alarm screamed through the building. A shrill, violent wail. Lights flashed. Students screamed in the hallway. Chows exploded. Greer whipped toward the door. This isn't a drill. Red's eyes narrowed. Tank cursed under his breath. Dylan froze, staring at Eli across the chaos. Eli didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't look away. And above them, the alarm shrieked merciless, relentless, drowning everything as the world tipped further into the unknown. The hallway had erupted into chaos. Sirens wailed through the building, lights strobing red across walls and faces, slicing everything into frantic flashes. The shrill alarm drilled into the skull, piercing, merciless, unrelenting. Principal Greer shoved the conference room door open wider. Evacuate. Now, students stampeded past, screaming, some with hands over their ears, others crying, all of them scrambling in the same panicked river toward the nearest exit. Bear stepped into the hallway, scanning both directions with the instincts of someone who'd survived more dangerous evacuations than any school had ever prepared for. Tank cursed under his breath. What the hell started this? Move. Khrir barked. Everyone out of the building. Red didn't move. He stood statue still in the doorway, the alarm snapping the world apart around him, his eyes locked on Eli. Eli stood frozen halfway between the room and the hall, his backpack sagging off one shoulder, his hair shaking from the vibrations in the floor. Red knelt slightly, enough to meet the boy's eye level. "You with me?" he yelled over the sirens. Eli nodded, but he didn't step forward. Red extended a hand. Another second passed before Eli's small fingers wrapped around his. Red rose and pulled him tight to his side with one arm as students slammed past like a rushing tide. Behind them, Dylan hovered near his parents, pale and trembling. Behind them, Mr. Harper grabbed him. "Move. We're leaving." Before they could finish the thought, a new scream cut through the hallway. "Smoke! There's smoke down the science wing." Khlir stiffened. "Everyone to the south. Exit." But the crowd was already running. Red turned sharply. "Out, now." Bear shoved the last straggling students toward the exit. Tank took up the rear, blocking any kids from ducking back into classrooms to grab their belongings. Greer rounded on Red. "You need to go too. Staff exit is down the—" Red cut her off. "Which wing is the science hall?" She hesitated. "East." "Why?" More students scrambled past, shoving them all toward the flow. Red tightened his grip on Eli. "Because fire alarms don't start themselves." Greer's face blanched. Bear looked at Tank. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Yeah." Tank muttered. "This ain't a kitchen fire." Another scream echoed from the far hall. Greer stepped into the center of the hallway traffic, waving her arms, trying desperately to direct the flood of terrified kids. "South exit. Keep moving." But then, a different alarm began blaring overhead. A deeper sound. Angrier. Red's jaw clenched. "That's not evacuation." Greer turned slowly toward the ceiling, horror twisting her face. "That's the lockdown siren." The hallway froze. Dozens of students skidded to a stunned stop. Eli's heart slammed in his chest. "Lockdown." At the same time as a fire alarm? Tank whispered, "That's impossible." Bear muttered, "Unless someone pulled both." Tank whispered, "Not closing fully. That's impossible." Screams erupted again. "Khlir palet. They're malfunctioning." Red's face hardened. "No. Someone forced them." Greer spun toward him. "Who would—" But she never finished the sentence, because in that exact moment, smoke curled out from the far end of the corridor. A single tendril at first, then a thick, black wave. The crowd's panic snapped back to life like a detonator. Students shrieked. Teachers shouted conflicting orders. The building became a hurricane of motion. Eli clung to Red's sleeve, coughing. As the smoke drifted closer, Red lowered himself to him. "You stay with me. You hear?" Eli nodded, eyes watering. Tank cupped his hands around his mouth. "Greer, we need a plan." Greer tried to force the jammed door fully open, but it barely budged. "They're not responding. The fire system and lockdown system are shorting each other out. I don't know how this happened." Bear squinted through the smoke. "Someone wanted chaos." Red turned to him sharply. "Not someone." He glanced down at Eli. Eli's eyes widened, and in that fragile second, a figure burst out of the smoke. Everyone jolted back. A student stumbled into the hallway, coughing violently. "Not someone." Greer rushed forward. "Are you hurt? Is anyone still in there?" The student grabbed her sleeve, eyes wild with terror. I saw him." "Who?" Greer demanded. Everyone jolted back. He was pouring something on the floor and lighting it. I thought he was joking at first. I didn't know. Red tensed. Who did you see? The student looked around frantically, terrified to say the name, but then their eyes landed on Dylan and stopped. Dylan froze, breath catching in his throat. Mrs. Harper exploded. Absolutely not. My son would never. The student shook their head violently. No, no, it wasn't Dylan. It was. They swallowed, trembling. His friend, every pair of eyes swung toward Dylan, his face drained of blood. Red stepped forward. Which friend? The student whispered. The tall one. The one with the black hoodie, the one you called. They hesitated. Eli finished it for them. Ethan. Dylan flinched like he'd been slapped. Mrs. Harper grabbed his arm, her voice rising into hysteria. You told us you weren't involved with that boy anymore. Dylan's face crumpled. I didn't know he'd do this. I swear. He texted me to meet him later. I didn't. Red thundered forward. Is he still in there? The student nodded frantically. I think so. He ran deeper into the wing when the alarm went off. Greer's heart hammered. We need to evacuate the East Hall immediately. Tank pointed down the smoke-filled corridor. Too late. Fires spreading fast. Bear growled. We gotta get out before the ceiling drops. Red didn't move. Eli stared up at him, gripping his hand tighter. Red dot. He's still inside. Red looked down at him. Something in the boy's expression, fear, worry, maybe even guilt hit him harder than any punch ever had. He crouched low. You stay with Bear, he ordered Eli. You don't move from his side. You understand. He ordered Eli. No, Red, you can't go in there. Red put a hand on Eli's shoulder. Kid. Someone's inside that might hurt other people. And someone who's inside might need help. Eli choked a breath. But what about you? Red gave him a grim half-smile. I've walked through worse fires than this. Bear grabbed Eli, pulling him gently but firmly behind him. Greer's voice cracked. Red, no protocol. Red turned his head just enough to speak over his shoulder. I don't follow protocol. Tank clapped his shoulder once. We're with you. Red shook his head. You stay with them, keep the exits clear. Tank's jaw tightened. Damn it, the smoke grew thicker, swirling like a living thing, curling around the emergency lights. Greer shouted, the fire department is only 3 minutes out. 2 minutes too long. Red muttered. Mrs. Harper screamed, why are you doing this? Red didn't bother answering. He sprinted straight into the smoke. The hallway swallowed him whole. Eli screamed. Red. Bear tightened his grip. Hold still, kid. Tank grabbed Greer. Where are the sprinklers? Why aren't they on? Greer's voice shook. Something's overridden them. I've never seen the system glitch like this. Tank's face darkened. This ain't a glitch. Someone did this on purpose. Before Greer could respond, a new sound exploded down the burning hall. A crash, a shout, a violent metallic slam like a locker door being thrown against the wall. Eli's breath caught. A violent metallic slam like a locker door being thrown against the wall. Another crash echoed. Then, silence. Thick. Smothering. Wrong. Eli tore out of Bear's grasp before anyone could stop him. Eli. No. Greer shouted. But he was already sprinting. Into the smoke. Into the fire. Toward the wing where Red had vanished. Tank cursed. I'll grab him. Bear shoved him. Go. Tank charged in after the boy. Greer tried to follow, choking on the smoke, but Bear held her back. Stay. You won't make it 10 feet. Mrs. Harper sobbed in the corner, clutching Dylan's arm. Dylan stared into the smoke, guilt ripping through him like claws. Bear coughed. Where the hell is the fire crew? And then, through the wall of smoke, a silhouette emerged, small, stumbling. Eli. His clothes were coated in ash, his face streaked with soot, his backpack half melted on one side. But he wasn't running. He wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He was shaking, horribly. And he was holding something in his hands, something blackened, something heavy, something that wasn't his. He took one more step into the visible light of the hallway, and every adult froze. Because clutched in Eli's soot-black fingers was Red's the leather biker vest, burned, scarred, barely intact. Eli lifted his shaking eyes toward them. He's still in there. His voice cracked open into a trembling whisper. Someone locked the door behind him. Greer staggered back. Tank's face went white. Bear froze, chest heaving. Eli took another step, his legs barely holding him. He tried to break it down. A tear cut a clean line down his ash-covered cheek, but someone was holding it shut. Silence fell so violently it felt like the walls were listening. Ellie's voice broke. He's trapped. Outside, sirens wailed closer. Inside, smoke thickened, and Eli stood there, clutching the burned leather vest to his chest, a symbol of everything Red was. As the building around them groaned under the weight of growing fire, his final whisper tore the world open. He may not have long. At the heart of this story lies a profound lesson: the courage to confront injustice and break the silence that so often surrounds it. Just like the characters who defied societal norms, toxic relationships, and harmful stereotypes, we too are called to challenge the unfairness in our lives, no matter how deeply entrenched it may seem. The story urges us to step out of the shadows of silence, to speak up when we witness wrongdoings, and to rise above the prejudices that limit us. In a world where many feel overwhelmed by expectations and the pressures of fitting into predefined molds, it's easy to forget our own worth. This story reminds us that self-respect and understanding our own value are not just personal victories, but powerful acts that ripple out to the world around us. It teaches us that, like gold forged through fire, the trials we face only strengthen our true character, shaping us into individuals capable of breaking free from negative cycles and standing tall in the face of adversity. As the old saying goes, what's done in the dark will come to light. And in the end, it's not about how others define us, but how we choose to define ourselves. So, it's not about how others define us. Have you ever had a moment where you felt forced to break free from something that no longer served you? Share your thoughts or any personal stories you might have. If this story resonated with you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next video filled with powerful narratives that inspire change. Wishing you peace amidst life's struggles and the quiet strength to keep moving forward, no matter the storm.